Welcome back to Empire Reimagined, Power and Politics in the 21st Century. I'm Kaede, and in our previous episode, we established how modern imperialism has traded colonial administrators for credit rating agencies, a stunning makeover that somehow managed to keep the same exploitative relationship intact. Today, we're diving into America First imperialism, Trump's hypothetical second term, examining how conservative nationalism provides the ideological scaffolding for American imperial ambitions. There's something darkly poetic about a nation founded in rebellion against an empire, becoming perhaps history's most sophisticated imperial power, all while insisting with straight-faced conviction that it stands for freedom and self-determination worldwide. What makes conservative nationalism particularly effective as an imperial framework is its remarkable ability to transform domination into protection, exploitation into partnership, and self-interest into global leadership. The Trump presidency offers a perfect case study in this ideological sleight of hand, presenting nakedly imperial ambitions as a defense of American interests and traditional values. By examining a hypothetical second Trump term from 2021-2025, we can isolate the core mechanisms through which conservative nationalism converts America First rhetoric into America over all policy, creating a template for understanding imperial justification across dramatically different political systems. The connections between conservative political theory and imperial ambition run remarkably deep, creating a throughline from Edmund Burke's defense of British imperialism in India to contemporary American exceptionalism. As political theorist Corey Robin argues in The Reactionary Mind, conservatism fundamentally defends hierarchies, whether domestic or international, making it the natural ideological home for imperial projects that depend on power asymmetries. The brilliance of conservative nationalist justification lies in its ability to present these asymmetries not as exploitation, but as natural order. The proper relationship between leading and following nations, between civilizational centers and peripheries, between the exceptionally destined and the ordinary. Conservative nationalism provides a remarkably consistent blueprint for imperial expansion across centuries, from manifest destiny, justifying American westward expansion in the 1840s, to America First, rationalizing global dominance in the 2020s. The core components remain stubbornly unchanged. A sense of exceptional destiny, a conviction that power comes with inherent rights, and the belief that dominating others is doing them a favor. What changes is merely the geographic scope and the specific mechanisms of control. When Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared in 2018 that the U.S. would build a new liberal order, while simultaneously abandoning multilateral institutions, he was articulating precisely this combination of exceptionalist destiny and unilateral power that defines conservative nationalist approaches to global affairs. The conservative nationalist approach to empire depends critically on two rhetorical maneuvers: denying imperial intent while exercising imperial power, and framing domination as leadership rather than control. When Trump administration officials repeatedly denied maintaining an empire while simultaneously threatening nations that didn't follow American directives, they were executing this doublespeak with textbook precision. A particularly revealing example came during trade negotiations with Japan in 2019, when threatened auto tariffs extracted concessions without formal demands. What a senior Treasury official later described as voluntarily accepting our position because the alternative would be worse. This isn't diplomacy. It's the imperial art of making threats so credible that you rarely need to execute them. The conservative nationalist blueprint for empire becomes particularly clear when examining territorial ambitions, where seemingly outlandish proposals reveal the underlying imperial mindset. Trump's 2019 interest in purchasing Greenland wasn't just a real estate developer's whim, but a reflection of the conservative nationalist view that territory is ultimately available to those with sufficient power and resources. When Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the proposal absurd, She was responding not just to a specific acquisition attempt, but to the imperial philosophy behind it, the belief that sovereignty is ultimately negotiable if the price is right. This attempt to purchase territory, reminiscent of the 1803 Louisiana Purchase or 1867 Alaska Purchase, reveals how conservative nationalism views national borders as obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to be respected. Let's examine our first case study of conservative nationalist imperialism in action, a hypothetical March 2025 Ukraine ceasefire brokered by the Trump administration. After years of grinding conflict following Russia's 2022 invasion, Trump's negotiators ostensibly pursue peace, while effectively ratifying Russian territorial gains across eastern Ukraine. The ceasefire requires Ukraine to recognize Russian sovereignty over approximately 20% of its pre-2022 territory, in exchange for security guarantees that notably lack NATO membership. A perfect example of how conservative nationalism facilitates imperial arrangements between great powers at the expense of smaller nations. Public statements cast this as ending the bloodshed and bringing stability to Europe, while the actual power dynamics reveal two imperial powers, America and Russia, dividing spheres of influence with minimal regard for Ukrainian sovereignty. What makes this ceasefire arrangement particularly revealing of conservative nationalist imperialism is how it combines power politics with traditional values rhetoric. Trump's announcement framing emphasizes saving Christian lives and preserving European heritage rather than strategic calculations, deploying conservative appeals to tradition, religion, and civilizational preservation to justify an essentially imperial arrangement. This rhetorical strategy echoes precisely how 19th-century conservative thinkers justified colonial expansion through appeals to civilization and Christianity. The effect is to transform naked power politics into moral imperative, suggesting that America's facilitation of Russian territorial expansion isn't geopolitical calculation, but virtuous protection of traditions and values threatened by prolonged conflict. The economic dimension of this Ukraine arrangement reveals the material interests behind the moral rhetoric. The ceasefire coincides with removal of sanctions on Russian energy exports, producing an immediate 18% drop in European natural gas, prices that American officials hail as economic relief for working families. This framing obscures how the arrangement primarily benefits powerful economic interests, particularly energy companies, that quickly sign new long-term supply contracts under favorable terms. When conservative nationalist rhetoric focuses public attention on traditional values and reduced consumer prices, it effectively diverts scrutiny from the core imperial dynamic. Strong nations imposing their will on weaker ones while extracting economic benefits. The seemingly disconnected elements, traditional values rhetoric, territorial concessions, and energy market adjustments, form a coherent package of imperial statecraft justified through conservative nationalist frameworks. Our second case study examines a hypothetical February 2025 Gaza plan that exemplifies conservative nationalist imperialism in action. Following years of regional conflict, Trump's administration unveils a Middle East peace and security initiative that effectively establishes American dominance in the region under the guise of humanitarian intervention. The plan includes controlled Palestinian relocation from Gaza to designated areas in the West Bank and neighboring countries, with massive American financial commitments, $25 billion in aid, attached to 43 specific policy requirements that recipient nations must accept. While presented as humanitarian assistance, the program's structure mirrors classic imperial arrangements where financial leverage translates directly into policy control. The Middle East gets money. America gets to dictate how countries operate. The conservative nationalist framing of this Gaza plan creates a masterclass in imperial rebranding. Rather than acknowledging the power dynamics at play, official communications emphasize regional stability, economic opportunity, and religious preservation. transforming what amounts to forced population movement and financial coercion into benevolent assistance. The specific emphasis on protecting religious sites and preserving cultural heritage provides classic conservative appeals to tradition that mask the fundamentally imperial arrangement. When Trump declares that these sacred lands deserve peace after centuries of conflict, he deploys precisely the civilizational rhetoric that conservative nationalists have used since Burke to justify imperial interventions. The implementation mechanism reveals the plan's imperial nature even more clearly than its content. Rather than working through multilateral institutions or seeking genuine regional consensus, the plan operates through bilateral agreements enforced by American financial and military leverage. Nations accepting relocated Palestinians receive substantial aid, but must also accept American military presence, intelligence sharing requirements, and economic policy constraints, essentially trading portions of their sovereignty for financial assistance. This approach represents precisely what political scientist Daniel Nexon terms imperial governmentality: control exercised not through direct rule, but through interlocking bilateral arrangements that collectively establish hierarchy while maintaining the fiction of sovereignty. Conservative nationalism excels at facilitating precisely this kind of arrangement, where traditional values rhetoric obscures raw power dynamics. Economic coercion serves as a primary mechanism through which conservative nationalist imperialism operates, using America's market size and financial dominance as leverage to extract concessions from trading partners. A hypothetical Trump administration from 2020-2025 would likely have expanded the use of tariffs as imperial instruments, moving beyond their initial application against China to target supposed allies. The numbers tell the story. Average U.S. tariff rates on imported goods increasing from 1.6% in 2016 to a hypothetical 7.2% by 2024, with threatened rates against specific countries reaching as high as 25%. This isn't free trade or even protectionism in any traditional sense. It's economic imperialism that uses market access as the carrot and financial strangulation as the stick. What makes tariffs particularly effective tools of conservative nationalist imperialism is their dual nature, simultaneously punishing and rewarding, depending on compliance with American demands. When the Trump administration threatened Mexico with escalating tariffs in 2019 unless the country reduced migration flows, it demonstrated precisely this imperial dynamic. Mexico wasn't being treated as a sovereign equal, but as a subordinate entity that must adapt its domestic policies to American preferences or face economic punishment. The conservative nationalist framing of these actions as protecting American workers and ensuring fair trade masks their fundamentally imperial character, using economic dominance to dictate other nations' internal affairs while claiming to pursue domestic interests. The imperial nature of this economic coercion becomes particularly clear when examining its selective application and enforcement. Throughout a hypothetical 2021-2025 term, tariff threats would likely be applied inconsistently, enforced against nations challenging American hegemony, while waived for compliant partners regardless of their actual trade practices. This selective enforcement mirrors classic imperial approaches, where rules exist primarily as leverage rather than principles. When Canadian officials complain about aluminum tariffs, while Saudi Arabia receives exemptions despite similar trade profiles, they're encountering precisely this imperial dynamic where political compliance matters more than actual economic behaviors. Conservative nationalism provides perfect cover for this selectivity by emphasizing relationships, loyalty, and alliance rather than consistent rules. The exact ideological framework that has justified imperial favoritism throughout history. To fully understand conservative nationalism's affinity for imperial projects, we must examine the ideological lineage connecting Edmund Burke's defense of British imperialism to contemporary America First rhetoric. Burke, widely considered conservatism's intellectual founder, famously defended British rule in India as necessary for maintaining order and civilization, arguing that imperial control served the interests of both ruling and subject populations. His 1783 speech on the East India Bill established the template for conservative imperial justification, claims that hierarchy preserves stability, that traditional values legitimize power asymmetries, and that certain peoples require external guidance. This Burkean framework persists remarkably intact in modern conservative nationalist rhetoric justifying American global dominance as necessary for international order. Corey Robin's landmark work, The Reactionary Mind, 2017, exposes the through line connecting these seemingly disparate manifestations of conservative imperial thought. Robin argues that conservatism fundamentally defends hierarchies, whether social, economic, or international, by presenting them as natural, necessary, and beneficial. This defense of hierarchy provides the perfect ideological framework for imperial projects that inherently depend on power asymmetries. When contemporary conservative nationalists assert American exceptionalisms allowing unilateral actions forbidden to others, they're executing precisely this intellectual operation, transforming power disparities into moral principles. The core conservative nationalist insight remains consistent. Domination isn't exploitation but leadership. Hierarchy isn't oppression but order. Imperial control isn't subjugation but protection. This conservative nationalist framing manifests with remarkable consistency across diverse policy domains, from military interventions justified as stabilization to economic coercion presented as fair competition. The Trump administration's hypothetical 2021 to 2025 approach to international institutions provides a perfect example, simultaneously withdrawing from multilateral frameworks while demanding other nations comply with American directives. This apparent contradiction makes perfect sense within conservative nationalist logic, where hierarchy, not reciprocity, forms the proper basis for international relations. When Trump declares that America won't be taken advantage of anymore, he's articulating precisely this conservative nationalist view that power disparities should translate directly into privilege disparities, the foundational assumption of imperial systems throughout history. Conservative nationalist rhetoric creates the ideological justification for imperial projects, but implementing these ambitions requires concrete institutional mechanisms, the actual infrastructure of imperial control. For a hypothetical Trump administration from 2021 to 2025, these mechanisms would likely include expanded use of sanctions as governance tools, with the number of sanctioned entities increasing from approximately 9,000 in 2020 to potentially 15,000 by 2025. Unlike traditional diplomatic tools, sanctions don't require consensus, negotiation, or consideration of other perspectives. They're unilateral assertions of power that depend solely on American financial and market dominance. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, effectively functions as a global economic judiciary, making determinations that impact millions worldwide without accountability to those affected, a perfect institutional embodiment of imperial governance. The military dimension of this imperial infrastructure appears not through colonial occupation, but through strategic base placement and defense agreements that establish de facto control without formal sovereignty claims. A hypothetical 2021 to 2025 Trump administration would likely have expanded the American military footprint in key regions, particularly the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe, while simultaneously denying any imperial intent. This approach creates what political scientist David Lake terms hierarchical order without territorial control, where security relationships establish dependency relationships that translate into policy influence. When smaller nations host American military assets, they inevitably surrender portions of their foreign policy autonomy, creating precisely the imperial relationship that conservative nationalism simultaneously exercises and denies. Perhaps most significantly, the economic infrastructure of American imperial power operates through dollar dominance, the ability to weaponize the global financial system to achieve policy objectives. When approximately 60% of global foreign exchange reserves and 80% of international trade transactions occur in dollars, the United States gains extraordinary leverage that no other nation possesses. A hypothetical Trump administration from 2021 to 2025 would likely have expanded the use of secondary sanctions, penalties applied to third parties doing business with sanctioned entities, effectively forcing nations to choose between access to the dollar system or relations with American adversaries. This mechanism represents imperial power in its purest form, the ability to make rules that others must follow without reciprocal constraints on the rulemaker. Conservative nationalist imperialism extends beyond traditional domains into technological spheres, creating new mechanisms of control through digital infrastructure and surveillance capabilities. A hypothetical 2021 to 2025 Trump administration would likely have accelerated efforts to exclude Chinese technology companies from global markets, while simultaneously demanding access to data worldwide for American intelligence agencies. This approach represents classic imperial double standards: technological sovereignty for the imperial center while denying the same to others. By 2025, this strategy would manifest through approximately 147 countries facing pressure to exclude Chinese technology from their 5G networks, while simultaneously accepting American surveillance backdoors. A perfect embodiment of technological imperialism, justified through conservative nationalist rhetoric about security and traditional values. The conservative nationalist framing of this technological imperialism proves particularly effective by linking digital dominance to national security and traditional values protection. When officials describe Chinese technology as threatening our way of life, while American surveillance capabilities represent protecting freedom, they're deploying precisely the conservative appeal to tradition that has justified imperial projects throughout history. This framing transforms naked power competition into moral imperative, suggesting that American technological dominance isn't about market control or surveillance capabilities, but about defending civilization itself. The consistent invocation of values, tradition, and security provides perfect ideological cover for what amounts to establishing technological spheres of influence reminiscent of 19th century imperial domains. Perhaps most importantly, this technological imperialism creates unprecedented capabilities for shaping global information environments without territorial control. When American social media platforms establish content policies that disproportionately affect political discourse in other nations, or when algorithmic systems trained on American data determine what billions worldwide see, we're witnessing imperialism operating through cultural and informational channels. A hypothetical Trump administration from 2021 to 2025 would likely have expanded government pressure on these platforms to align with American foreign policy objectives, creating what media scholar Siva Vaidyanathan terms algorithmic imperialism, where American cultural and political preferences quietly shape global information flows without obvious foreign policy fingerprints. Intriguingly, conservative political thought also contains powerful anti-imperial traditions that stand in stark contrast to conservative nationalism's imperial tendencies. Figures like conservative philosopher Russell Kirk warned specifically against imperial overreach, arguing that a nation that becomes an empire thereby becomes a tyranny to others and eventually to itself. This traditionalist conservative perspective views empire as fundamentally corrupting to republican virtues and traditional values, creating precisely the centralized power and cultural degradation that conservatism ostensibly opposes. This strain of conservative thought emphasizes local control, fiscal restraint, and cultural continuity, values incompatible with imperial adventures requiring massive federal power, deficit spending, and cultural disruption. This conservative anti-imperialism found limited but significant expression during Trump's presidency, particularly in his periodic statements questioning overseas commitments and criticizing endless wars. However, these anti-imperial impulses remained largely rhetorical rather than operational, frequently overshadowed by nationalist advisors promoting traditional imperial ambitions through conservative framing. The hypothetical 2021 to 2025 term would likely have continued this tension between anti-imperial rhetoric and imperial practice, with conservative nationalist voices consistently prevailing in actual policy formation. This triumph of nationalist imperial thinking over traditional conservative caution represents a profound tragedy for authentic conservative principles, transforming a political philosophy potentially compatible with international equality into a justification for global dominance. The road not taken, a genuine conservative anti-imperialism, would have emphasized the constitutional limits on executive power, the fiscal impossibility of global military dominance, and the cultural corrosion imperial ambitions inevitably produce. This perspective appears periodically in conservative discourse, but rarely transforms into sustained policy. When Senator Rand Paul criticizes unauthorized military interventions, he's channeling precisely this conservative anti-imperial tradition that views constitutional restraint as more important than geopolitical advantage. The hypothetical Trump administration from 2021 to 2025 represents a missed opportunity for this authentic conservative vision, instead reinforcing how easily conservative nationalism transforms legitimate concerns about tradition, security, and identity into justifications for imperial dominance. As we conclude our examination of conservative nationalist imperialism, several key insights emerge that help explain the remarkable persistence of imperial dynamics despite changing rhetoric and methods. First, conservative nationalism provides uniquely effective ideological justification for imperial projects by transforming power asymmetries into moral principles. When Trump declares that America deserves better deals, or that other nations have taken advantage of us, he's executing precisely this ideological operation, presenting imperial assertions not as domination, but as restoration of proper order. This framing proves remarkably effective across political contexts because it appeals to deeply held beliefs about tradition, security, and identity, while obscuring the fundamentally imperial nature of the policies themselves. Second, conservative nationalist imperialism operates through specific institutional mechanisms that establish control without formal colonization, creating empire while denying its existence. The combination of financial leverage, military positioning, technological dominance, and cultural influence creates comprehensive systems of control that don't require territorial administration. This approach proves particularly effective because it maintains the fiction of sovereignty while establishing actual hierarchical relationships, allowing powerful nations to extract imperial benefits without imperial responsibilities. When America maintains 750-plus military bases worldwide while insisting it's not an empire, or when it sanctions nations for policies it dislikes while claiming to respect sovereignty, it's executing precisely this doublespeak that characterizes modern imperial systems. Finally, the conservative nationalist justification for imperialism exploits legitimate concerns about tradition, security, and community to advance fundamentally exploitative relationships. The genius of this approach lies in connecting authentic human values to imperial projects that ultimately undermine those very values. When Trump justifies tariffs as protecting American workers while simultaneously pursuing policies that primarily benefit multinational corporations, he's executing this bait-hand switch with textbook precision. This dynamic explains why imperial policies frequently receive support from populations harmed by them. The conservative nationalist framing creates cognitive and emotional connections between policies that extract wealth from ordinary people and values those same people genuinely cherish. Breaking this connection represents perhaps the most important challenge for those seeking more equitable international relationships. In our next episode, Russia's Shadow, Imperial Nostalgia and the Ukraine War, we'll shift our focus from American imperialism to examine how conservative nationalism similarly fuels Russian imperial ambitions. We'll explore how Putin's regime has weaponized historical narratives, cultural connections, and traditional values to justify territorial aggression against neighboring states, particularly Ukraine. From Catherine the Great's empire to today's Russian world ideology, we'll trace the conservative nationalist lineage that transforms naked power politics into civilizational mission and territorial conquest into cultural preservation. We'll analyze specific mechanisms through which Russia's imperial project operates, from territorial occupation and forced Russification to economic coercion and information warfare. Our case study will examine how Russia's control of approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory by 2025 represents not merely military conquest, but a comprehensive imperial project rooted in conservative nationalist conceptions of civilizational space and hierarchical order. We'll also explore how the hypothetical March 2025 ceasefire discussed in today's episode effectively ratifies Russian territorial gains while maintaining the fiction of Ukrainian sovereignty, demonstrating how modern imperial arrangements frequently involve collaboration between competing imperial powers at the expense of smaller nations. Before we conclude today's episode, I want to thank you for joining me in this exploration of how conservative nationalism provides ideological justification for imperial projects in the 21st century. Understanding these dynamics isn't merely academic. It directly affects everything from the price you pay for consumer goods to the possibility of living in a genuinely democratic society. If you found this analysis valuable, please share it with others seeking to understand how global power operates beneath the surface of diplomatic rhetoric and news headlines. Next week, we'll continue our journey through empire's evolution by examining how Putin's Russia demonstrates that imperialism remains alive and well in the supposedly post-imperial age, just with different justifications and mechanisms than its 19th century predecessors. I'm Kaede, reminding you that empires haven't disappeared. They've just updated their ideological justifications, while hoping we won't notice the familiar pattern of the strong imposing their will on the weak.